The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of mechanical insects. Sarah Chen pushed through the ER doors at Mercy General at 11:08 p.m., 3 years into the kind of invisibility she'd earned through competence and silence. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic hit first, then the sound. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm down the corridor, and somewhere a monitor beeped with the patience of a metronome counting down to something none of them could stop. She clipped her badge to her scrubs, the lanyard already worn smooth from nights like these, and moved through the hallway as if she'd never left it. The night shift at Mercy General was a kingdom unto itself. The day nurses ruled with visibility and hierarchy, but after dark, the hospital belonged to the ones who showed up and stayed quiet. Sarah had learned this 3 years ago when she'd walked away from everything, 15 years as a senior chief petty officer, 3 deployments to Helmand Province, a career that had left her listening for helicopters in her sleep and flinching at every siren. She'd disappeared without telling even her sister where she'd gone, just packed a car and found this hospital in Houston where nobody asked questions and a woman with scarred hands could disappear into the rhythm of monitors and 4 lines. Here, she was just another nurse. Nobody's rank. Nobody's hero. Just Sarah, the quiet one who caught mistakes nobody else saw. The night charge nurse, Patricia, waved from the station. Bed 7 is stable. Bed 3 needs another dose at midnight. And Sterling is hunting for something to complain about, so don't give him the opening. Patricia had been doing this for 23 years and spoke in the shorthand of people who understood that information was currency on the night shift. She didn't ask Sarah where she came from or why she moved through the hospital like someone trained to leave no trace. She just nodded when Sarah passed and went back to her charts. Sarah moved to the locker room to stow her bag. She kept it simple, a change of scrubs, phone, a black coffee in a thermos that never got quite full because she never quite had time to drink it. In the bottom left corner, folded small enough to hide in her palm, was the unit patch from her final deployment. 75th Ranger Regiment. The scroll was faded now, the stitching loose where she'd worried it with her fingers during sleepless nights. She'd sewn it into the lining of her jacket the morning she left Fort Benning, a piece of her she couldn't quite leave behind even though she'd left everything else. The jacket stayed in the locker, the patch stayed hidden. The pass stayed folded. Room for 12 was where the trouble started. Sarah caught the scent of anxiety before she rounded the corner, sweat, fear, the sharp electric smell of adrenaline. A cardiac patient, Mr. Jameson, 64 years old, post-MI, surrounded by his entire extended family like they could hold him to the earth by sheer will. Dr. Marcus Sterling stood at the bedside with a chart in one hand and that particular expression physicians wore when they were about to remind everyone in the room that they were the smartest one present. Sterling had been at Mercy General for 7 years, old money, Ivy League education, the kind of surname that appeared on hospital wing donations. He had the look of a man who'd never been told no and couldn't imagine why anyone would try. The anticoagulant dosing is standard protocol, Sterling was saying, his voice pitched to reach the family and exclude the nursing staff. Your father is getting exactly what every cardiac patient receives. Sarah glanced at the chart as she entered to check the 4 line. The numbers didn't align. They never aligned when Sterling was on the floor. His handwriting was neat, but the dosing calculation for the patient's weight and renal function was off by 30%, the kind of error that looked like mathematics but was actually a pathway to clotting complications. The kind that killed people quietly in their sleep. Doctor, Sarah said, her voice low and measured, the dosing calculation needs review. The room went still. Sterling's head turned toward her with the slow precision of something predatory. His eyes were grey, the color of winter water, and they held the absolute certainty of someone who'd never encountered genuine correction. Excuse me. His voice carried a blade wrapped in courtesy. Are you questioning my medical judgment, Sarah? She kept her eyes on the monitor. The renal clearance adjustment wasn't applied. It will cause accumulation. I have been practicing medicine, Sterling said, turning to address the family now, for 22 years. I think I understand anticoagulant protocols. Some people seem to think they know better than their physicians, and that kind of arrogance is why we have quality control problems in nursing. He smiled at Mr. Jameson's daughter. Don't worry. She's just one of our floor nurses. I assure you, I know what I'm doing." The family laughed, the sound of social permission. Sarah felt nothing. She'd learned in Helmand Province that humiliation required agreement, and she didn't agree with any of this. She made a note on the chart in her precise handwriting, anticoagulant dosing flagged for recalculation per renal function. Then she adjusted the D4 rate without another word and moved out of the room. The break room was supposed to be neutral territory. Sarah had learned in 3 years that it wasn't. She grabbed her thermos and sat in the vinyl chair by the window where she could see the parking lot. Within 40 seconds, the exodus began. 2 night nurses collected their snacks and drifted toward the hallway. An aide mentioned something about needing to check on patients. The room cleared with the choreography of something rehearsed. Sterling must have said something about her, must have used words like difficult or liability or dangerous autonomy. The staff had learned which way the wind blew. She watched the rain start in the parking lot, drops hitting the windshields of cars in the physician lot. The expensive ones. Sterling's was German, black, the kind of vehicle that announced its own importance. She drank her coffee without tasting it. By midnight, Sterling had escalated. He posted a formal write-up on the unit board in front of everyone, his handwriting careful, his accusation surgical. Insubordination and dangerous autonomy. The kind of language designed to create a paper trail. The kind of documentation that could destroy a career if someone cared enough to make it stick. Sarah read it without changing expression. One of the younger nurses, Thomas, said quietly, "That's bullshit, Sarah. We all know it." "It's fine," Sarah said. "The patient in 412 is alive because I caught his mistake, and we both know it." She didn't say what she didn't need to say, that she'd voluntarily walked away from 15 years of rank and authority, that she'd learned how to make herself invisible because invisibility kept her alive. That she'd spent 3 years trying to disappear from a version of herself that couldn't stop listening for incoming fire. The night stretched forward in the familiar rhythm of vitals and 4 lines. Sarah moved from bed to bed with the kind of precision that came from training, her hands steady, her movements economical. She'd learned medicine from field hospitals and combat situations, where the margin between life and death was milliseconds and your hands were all you had. Hospital nursing felt like operating in slow motion. The ambulance arrived at 2:13 a.m. The radio chatter came first, male, approximately 35, stab wound to left shoulder, possible deep tissue involvement, Glasgow coma scale 15, patient is alert and oriented, and then the stretcher, and then the bleeding. A lot of it. The man on the stretcher had the look of someone who'd been in a fight and lost. His shirt was soaked through with dark blood. His left shoulder bloomed red where the wound had opened. But what caught Sarah's attention was his face, the kind of face that didn't react to pain, the kind of stillness that only came from training. No identification on him, the paramedic said. Found him on the corner of 5th and Main. No wallet. No phone. Guy won't say his name or where he's from. They got him into a trauma bay. Sarah moved with the team, cutting away the shirt, exposing the wound, cleaning it enough to assess the depth. The bleeding was controlled now, but the injury was serious. The stab had gone deep, maybe into the rotator cuff, possibly deeper. The kind of injury that didn't come from a mugging. While she worked, she felt something in the fabric of his jacket. She kept working, compression to control bleeding, careful assessment of the wound depth, preparing him for imaging. But as she moved him to get a better angle, her hand brushed against his collar, and she felt it again. Metal. Hard. Worn smooth. Dog tags. She could feel the shape of them without seeing them. The team got him stabilized and up to ICU. Sarah followed as the nurses transferred him, and in that moment of controlled chaos, the beeping monitors, the nurses calling out vitals, everyone focused on the machinery of keeping him alive, she reached into the jacket collar. Her fingers found the chain and the tags beneath. She pulled them free with the kind of motion that looked accidental, like she was checking his airway, and the dog tags came loose in her palm. She read them in the second before a nurse's head turned toward her. 75th Ranger Regiment. Sarah slipped the tags into her scrub pocket without breaking rhythm. She didn't know this man. She didn't know how he'd ended up bleeding on a street corner in Houston. But she knew that patch. She knew that unit. And she knew that the injuries on his body, the deliberation, the depth, the location, weren't random. This wasn't a mugging. This was something else entirely. The rain continued hammering the hospital windows as Sarah helped get the Ranger settled into ICU bed 4. His eyes closed as the sedatives took hold. Around her, the monitors established their rhythm, the beeping that meant he was still alive, the numbers that meant his heart was still fighting. She touched her pocket where the dog tags rested against her ribs, the weight of them small but impossible to ignore. Patricia found her at the station 20 minutes later. "You're going to want to see the wound assessment when you're ready. Deep. Professional. That's no street fight." Sarah nodded without looking up from the chart. She already knew. She'd felt it the moment her hands touched the injury, the kind of wound that came from someone who knew exactly how to use a blade. The night shift stretched forward into its darkest hours. Sarah moved between patients, checked vitals, adjusted medications, existed in the space where she'd learned to hide in plain sight. But her awareness stayed on ICU bed 4, on the unconscious Ranger with no identification and injuries that told their own story. She could feel the dog tags in her pocket like a compass pointing toward something she'd spent 3 years trying to leave behind. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows of Mercy General, and somewhere in the building, Dr. Sterling slept the sleep of men who'd never questioned their own certainty. He had no idea that one of his floor nurses had just made a decision that would eventually bring soldiers to his hospital. He had no idea that the bleeding stranger in ICU bed 4 was the thread that would unravel everything he'd built. Dr. Sterling's write-up appeared on the unit board Monday morning, typed on official letterhead in that particular font that made even compliments sound like accusations. Insubordination and dangerous autonomy, it read. Question physician's medical judgment in front of patient and family. Created atmosphere of doubt regarding competency. Recommendation, immediate corrective action and mandatory retraining. His signature at the bottom sat heavy, 3 sharp initials that looked like a threat. Sarah read it once while pulling her gloves on, absorbing each word the way combat medics absorb incoming fire, not with emotion, but with precision. The patient in room 412 was alive. That was the only fact that mattered. Everything else was theater. But the theater had an audience. The break room that afternoon was crowded, 6 nurses rotating through lunch, the smell of microwave coffee cutting through the antiseptic-soaked fabric of the hospital itself. Sarah pushed open the door, saw the occupied table, and selected an empty chair near the window. Quiet, out of the way. The way she preferred everything. She'd barely opened her yogurt when the exodus began. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. First, Martinez stood abruptly, his sandwich half-eaten. Forgot I'm supposed to cover trauma intake. He didn't make eye contact. Then came Rivera, gathering her things with the kind of urgency that suggested she'd suddenly remembered something urgent that didn't exist. One by one, they collected plates and cups and phones, their movements coordinated with an precision that felt rehearsed. By the time the third nurse left, the message had crystallized in the room like ice forming on glass. Nobody would sit with her. The last to leave was Jessica, who'd worked nights alongside Sarah for 18 months. Jessica hesitated at the doorway, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, Sarah thought she might turn back. Instead, Jessica followed the others into the corridor, her shadow disappearing without an apology. Sarah continued eating her yogurt. One spoonful. Another. The room hummed with the ambient white noise of an institutional kitchen, the refrigerator's compressor, the distant clatter of trays from the dish room, the barely audible buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. She chewed slowly, methodically. Ate for fuel, not comfort. This was something she knew how to do. The break room door opened again. Dr. Sterling. He carried a surgical tablet and a smile that belonged in a reptile house, present, but somehow not quite alive. He moved to the coffee station with the deliberate slowness of someone entering a scene they'd orchestrated. "Ah, Nurse Chen. Good. I wanted to discuss your recent performance review directly." Sarah set down her spoon. Measured breath. "Eye contact. Your approach to patient care," Sterling continued, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man used to being listened to, "suggests you've misunderstood your role here at Mercy General. You're a floor nurse, not a physician. Your job is to follow protocols, not to second-guess the judgment of someone with a medical degree." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't know what military hospital you trained in, but nursing isn't about playing hero. It's about humility." The word hung in the break room like something corrosive. Sarah set her yogurt container on the table with deliberate care. Straightened in her chair. When she spoke, her voice came out level, not quiet, not angry, but something closer to the tone a person uses when reciting facts. "The patient in 412 is alive because I caught your error. We both know that." Sterling's expression flickered, surprise, then something darker. His next words came sharper, each one a small blade. "You caught nothing. You questioned nothing. You overstepped, and now you're manufacturing justifications for insubordination. This is exactly the kind of liability I'm talking about." He left before she could respond, his tablet tucked under one arm like a weapon he'd just laid down on the table and expected her to interpret correctly. Sarah finished her yogurt in silence. Her hands were steady. Her breathing had not changed. The room still hummed its fluorescent song, and somewhere down the corridor, Jessica was explaining to the others why she'd had to leave so quickly. The mask held. It always did. By Wednesday, Sarah had spent 6 hours assisting with the Ranger patient, still unnamed, still unconscious most of the time, but stable. His shoulder wound had begun showing signs of secondary infection, and the wound bed required aggressive debridement. That's when the Army Ranger medic arrived. His name was Brennan. Staff Sergeant. He had the kind of weathered face that came from too many months in places where the sun burned through skin and memory alike. He was detailed to the ICU to observe patient care protocols, some interagency oversight thing that Sarah didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. She was irrigating the shoulder wound, a normal saline, careful pressure, the kind of meticulous repetition that formed muscle memory when she began the closure. 3-layer technique. Subcutaneous closure with 3.0 vicryl, dermal closure with 4.0 vicryl, running subcuticular stitch. Her hands moved through the sequence with the kind of precision that only came from doing something 1,000 times under circumstances where mistakes killed people. Brennan froze. Sarah felt it before she understood it, the absolute stillness of someone who'd just seen something impossible. She didn't look up from her work. Just continue the final knot, tying it off with the same steady pressure. "Where did you learn that stitch pattern?" Her hands completed the work. She set down the instruments, peeled off her gloves, and turned to face him. His eyes were the color of weathered stone, and they'd gone very, very alert. "Only one unit teaches that closure sequence," Brennan continued quietly. Field Hospital 7. 2014 through 2016. Combat medicine training. "I only know because I taught it there." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, recognition, but also confusion. "Who trained you?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "A long time ago." That was the moment she knew the anonymity was fracturing. That the careful distance she'd constructed between the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become had a visible crack running through it. Brennan studied her face, piecing together information she'd never wanted him to have, and she let him. There was no point in pretending. Not to someone who read trauma the way other people read language. Later that night, she photographed the dog tags. The faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn into the jacket lining came next, careful work, the kind of photography that required steady hands and a clear purpose. She used her phone camera, adjusted the lighting, made sure the details were sharp. Unit designation. Date of issue. All of it visible. She sat in the break room after her shift, when the hospital had settled into its 4 a.m. silence and pulled up an old contact. JSOC operations. A name she'd memorized 12 years ago and never forgotten. Just in case. Just in case she ever needed to be who she'd been. Her message was brief, running a trace on 75th Ranger. Admitted Mercy General Houston. No ID. Dog tags inside jacket lining. Anyone looking for him? She sent it at 3:51 a.m. from a hospital Wi-Fi she shouldn't have had access to, using credentials that belonged to an employee named Sarah Chen, floor nurse. Then she waited. The phone remained silent for 3 hours. Then 4. Sarah worked through the rest of her shift, drew labs, changed for bags, documented in medical records with her carefully neat handwriting. Normal. Professional. The kind of nursing that no one noticed because it was done exactly right. By 07:38 a.m., her personal phone buzzed. One message, from a number she didn't recognize. Stand by. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Sarah clocked out. Drove home in Houston heat that made the asphalt shimmer. She didn't know, yet, that 3 hours from now her badge would be seized. That Sterling's board call had already been made. That the network she'd activated by sending those photographs had already begun moving through channels and security protocols and phone lines that connected to places she'd spent 15 years trying to leave behind. All she knew was that the bleeding stranger in ICU bed 4 had worn the colors of the Rangers, and somewhere in the architecture of her own buried past, something had just been set in motion that could never be stopped. The monitor above ICU bed 4 showed a rhythm that shouldn't have been possible. Sarah watched from the corridor as the Ranger's heart rate climbed, then climbed again, then went flat. Not the gradual descent of a patient slipping away. This was catastrophic. This was a heart strangled by its own fluid. She moved toward the room without thinking. Her feet knew the way. Sterling was already there, barking into his phone with the tone of a man who'd never held a scalpel in an emergency. Surgical team to ICU. Now. Possible tamponade, patient is decompensating. For words that should have been 3 minutes faster. He gestured at the monitor like the numbers would change if he gestured harder. Get me 2 large bore lines. 2 units O negative standing by. The resident froze. The 2 nurses on shift looked to Sterling, waiting for actual orders instead of theater. The monitor beeped once. Nothing. Beeped again. Flat line stretched across the screen like a sentence that wouldn't end. Sarah was already gloved and moving. Muscle memory and something older than training. She opened the crash cart with her left hand while grabbing an 18-gauge needle with her right. The needle caught the light, silver, precise, a thing designed to puncture the invisible boundary between living and dead. She didn't say excuse me. She didn't ask permission. She simply occupied the space where Sterling had been standing, her presence so immediate and commanded that he stepped back without registering he'd moved. Patient presents with acute cardiac tamponade. Her voice had changed. It was deeper now, flat, the voice of someone who'd said this before over the roar of helicopter blades. Missed stab wound created pericardial effusion. Blood pooling around the heart. We have maybe 90 seconds before he arrests completely. Sterling's face reddened. That's my patient, and you're a floor nurse. Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't in Houston anymore. She was in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where the power had failed 3 times and she'd run for lines by flashlight while rounds came through the mud walls. Where she'd learned that hesitation killed faster than any bullet. She felt for the space between ribs. 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The Ranger's chest was still, which meant no breathing, which meant the tamponade had compressed his lungs along with everything else. She cleaned the site with 1 antiseptic wipe. 1. There wasn't time for 2. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was immediate, a sound like pressure release, like a door opening in a sealed room. Clear fluid mixed with dark blood came back into the syringe. She pulled gently, methodically. 80 ccs. 90. 100. The monitor changed its rhythm from flatline to something weaker but real. Chaotic but alive. O2 sat climbing, one of the nurses called out. She was watching the monitor now, not Sterling. 68. 72. 79. Sarah didn't stop. She'd been trained to feel for the moment when the pressure released, when the heart had room to beat again. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this in darkness, in chaos, with people screaming and mortar fire shaking the walls. This fluorescent-lit ICU was a luxury. This patient was breathing, however barely. 120 ccs. The needle trembled in her fingers, not from fear. From restraint. From the force required to move this slowly, this precisely, when every cell in her body wanted to move faster. 85, the nurse said. Climbing. 87. 88. The monitor was showing something that resembled normal sinus rhythm now. Ragged, still struggling, but rhythm. The ranger's color was changing from the gray of the dead back toward something that resembled living flesh. His oxygen saturation continued its climb. 90. 92. Stable. The crash cart was rolling through the doors now, 3 people moving with the synchronized precision of an actual trauma team. They stopped, seeing a floor nurse with her hand in a patient's chest cavity, seeing a line of dark blood in the syringe, seeing a heart monitor that had come back from the dead. Patient is stable, Sarah said. She didn't look at Sterling. She was already reaching for sterile gauze to cover the needle site. Pericardiocentesis successful. 120 ccs of hemorrhagic fluid evacuated. Cardiac output restored. One of the crash team nurses stepped forward, older woman, maybe mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who'd seen things. She was staring at Sarah's hands. At the precision of the needle insertion. At the way she'd moved like she was reading sheet music instead of improvising in real time. Where did you learn to do that? It wasn't a question. It was an interrogation. Sarah finished securing the gauze. She disposed of the needle with movements that belonged in an operating room, not a hospital corridor. Only then did she turn to the woman, and her eyes, the same eyes that had absorbed Sterling's contempt without flinching, were different now. Colder. Clear-headed. The eyes of someone who'd made decisions that affected whether people lived or died. Field medicine training, Sarah said. Her voice was still the command voice, the one that didn't ask for permission. Trauma protocols from, she caught herself. Barely. From specialized coursework. A long time ago. The woman's expression shifted. Recognition of something, though Sarah couldn't tell what. The crash team moved in anyway, professional and efficient, taking over the monitoring and preparation for whatever surgery Sterling might authorize if he ever remembered how his mouth worked. He was standing in the corner now, his face the color of old blood, watching a floor nurse who wasn't supposed to know pericardiocentesis technique stand in the space where he should have been. Sarah peeled off her gloves. 2 of them, contaminated with the ranger's blood. She could see it under her fingernails, copper dark against pale skin. Hands that had held lives together. Hands that knew things her mouth had never spoken. She turned to leave, and Sterling moved to intercept her, his voice finding itself again, shaking with something that might have been rage or might have been the dawning understanding that he'd just watched someone step into a room wearing hospital scrubs and leave it wearing military precision like a uniform. "Where is your credentials for advanced cardiac procedures?" he demanded. "Who authorized you to perform?" The patient's heart wasn't beating, Sarah said. It was the measured tone of quiet dignity. Absolute, unarguable. I restarted it. You can file a complaint if the paperwork bothers you more than the outcome. She walked past him without waiting for an answer, and Sterling didn't follow. What followed instead was the silence of a room full of people who'd just watched a nurse perform a procedure that required either years of specialized training or something closer to muscle memory. The kind of muscle memory that comes from places where paperwork mattered less than whether someone made it out of the day alive. But that silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the ranger medic who'd recognized her surgical technique earlier that week appeared in the ICU entrance, having heard the code over the hospital radio. He looked at Sarah. Then at the patient, now stabilized. Then back at Sarah, his eyes widening with understanding that went deeper than just recognizing a medical skill. "Your 75th Ranger Regiment," he said. It wasn't a question. That stitch pattern. That procedure. The way you moved. He took a step closer, and his voice dropped to something only she could hear. "Who were you?" Sarah didn't answer. She simply walked past him toward the supply room, where she would wash her hands and watch the ranger's blood spiral down the drain, and inside the pocket of her scrubs, she could feel the weight of 2 sets of dog tags. The one she'd slipped from the patient. The one she'd been carrying since her husband died. What she didn't know was that the photograph she'd sent to her old JSOC contact 3 days ago had already begun moving through channels and secure phones and encrypted messages that connected to people who'd spent the last 6 years waiting for her to surface. All she knew was that somewhere above her, in offices with classified clearances and Pentagon phone lines, the phone was ringing. Again. And this time, the people answering weren't going to let the call go unanswered. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. An OR nurse, one of Sterling's golf foursome regulars, found him in the physician's lounge at 1438, sitting with his coffee going cold, and whispered that Sarah Chen had contacted someone at JSOC. Not a request for information. A photograph. 2 photographs. The ranger's dog tags. The unit patch. A former military contact receiving classified material about an active patient. Sterling's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. The coffee cup hovered. His pupils dilated in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lights overhead. This wasn't a competence question anymore. This was a breach. This was a threat to the entire arrangement, the phantom billing codes, the inflated procedure charges, the insurance company kickbacks that had funded his new house in Sugar Land, the Mercedes, the country club membership that cost $42,000 annually. He set the cup down without drinking. By 1512, Sterling had called the hospital board's chairman, Lawrence Bancroft, a man he'd been shooting 18 holes with every Thursday for 7 years. The conversation lasted 42 seconds. Sterling's voice was measured, concerned, the tone of a conscientious physician reporting a serious compliance violation. Sarah Chen had stolen patient property, protected medical identification that belonged in the hospital record. She had contacted unauthorized military personnel without authorization or protocol. She had potentially compromised the patient's safety and privacy. This was a HIPAA violation. This was a security risk. This required immediate investigation. Bancroft said he would handle it. By 1609, Sterling had initiated the second phase. He contacted an investigator named Harold Voss, a former hospital administrator who owed Sterling a significant favor from the time Sterling had helped his nephew get admitted to Baylor Medical School despite a middling MCAT score. Voss was thorough. Voss was discreet. Voss was perfectly willing to make some calls to Sarah Chen's former military references and ask a few quiet questions about her service record, her conduct, her stability post-deployment. The dead end started immediately. No one answered. No forwarding information. No medical files. No discharge paperwork. The more Voss dug, the less he found, which in Sterling's mind meant only one thing: she was hiding something. Something classified. Something big enough that making inquiries about it triggered protocol that simply blocked the channels. Which meant she was either still connected to active operations or she'd left something behind that was still operational. Either way, she was dangerous. By Thursday, Sterling had filed a preliminary suspension report with the hospital's HR department, citing insubordination, potential HIPAA violations, and possession of protected patient information. By 1744 on Friday afternoon, Sarah Chen's badge had been seized by the security guard who'd smiled at her every single morning for 3 years while she arrived for her night shift. The same guard who'd sometimes brought her coffee from the lobby cafe when he noticed her carrying a thermos that was always empty by the end of her 12 hours. The same guard who'd said, "You okay, Ms. Chen? You look tired," and actually waited for an answer. Today he wouldn't meet her eyes. The suspension notice was printed on official hospital letterhead. Pending investigation. All access revoked. Do not return to the unit. Do not contact patients. Do not speak to staff. The words on the page were the same words that would have ended careers for most people. Sarah took the envelope, thanked the security guard politely, and walked to her locker to collect her belongings. She owned very little. A change of clothes for after shifts. A spare pair of shoes. A book she'd been reading for 4 months and never finished. Beneath the spare shoes, wrapped in a thin plastic bag, were her husband's dog tags. She'd kept them there since the day she learned he'd been killed in a helicopter crash near Kandahar 7 years ago. She'd kept them there through every application to nursing school, every shift, every patient she'd held as they were dying, waiting for them to recognize something in her hands that might make their own passing feel less lonely. She added the Rangers' dog tags to the bag. The drive to the Veterans Cemetery in northwest Houston took 32 minutes through traffic that felt like moving through water. Rain had started somewhere between the hospital and the freeway, not a downpour, but the kind of persistent autumn rain that came in layers, each one penetrating deeper than the last. By the time she reached the gates, her scrubs were soaked. She didn't stop to get a jacket from the car. The grave was in Section B, Row 12, Plot 7. She'd memorized the coordinates years ago the way soldiers memorize coordinates for extraction points. 8 rows from the oak tree. For graves down. The headstone was weathered, which meant he'd been there long enough for the granite to accept the rain as a permanent condition. She knelt on the wet grass without feeling the cold seeping through her knees. "I tried," she whispered. "Like you said. Disappear. Heal. Don't let anyone know who you were. Don't tell your sister where you went. Don't leave a forwarding address. Don't contact the unit. Don't be visible." Her hands shook, not with fear, but with the physical manifestation of restraint finally breaking. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small plastic bag containing both sets of dog tags. Her husband's, worn smooth by years in someone's pocket, the engraving faded to almost nothing. The Rangers, sharp and new, the lettering still crisp, still clean, still readable. "I was invisible," she continued. "For 3 years. And then he came in bleeding, and I couldn't." She stopped. Placed both sets of tags on the headstone next to his name. Watched the rain collect on the metal, making everything shimmer like something halfway between this world and another one. "I failed at disappearing. And I couldn't save you. And now I can't." She didn't finish. The words caught somewhere in her chest where they'd been stored since the moment that CH-53E Dragon had gone down with his entire squad. She reached out and touched the headstone, her fingers tracing the date of death, and felt the rain on her face mix with something that wasn't rain. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. Soldiers kneel in the dark with dog tags in their hands and let the sky do the weeping for them. She had no idea what was happening simultaneously at the Pentagon, in the offices where her JSOC contact had opened her encrypted message. No idea that her message had been flagged not as a casual inquiry but as a potential compromise to an active investigation. No idea that a senior officer had read the timestamp of her contact and connected it to the Ranger medic's observations. No idea that somewhere in a secure facility, 3 phones had started ringing at the exact same moment. And then she heard it. Distant at first. A rhythm in the rain that was separate from the rain itself. A sound that belonged to a different kind of sky. The helicopter was still 7 minutes out, but the rotor wash carried on the wind, and Sarah Chen, who had spent 15 years learning to read danger in atmospheric pressure, looked up. The rain continued to fall as the sky began to darken with something that wasn't weather. Monday morning came with the sound of helicopter rotors that weren't actually there. Sarah stood in the parking lot of Mercy General, her personnel box balanced against her hip, listening to the phantom rotor wash that only soldiers heard. The rain had stopped. The sky had cleared. She had 45 minutes to collect the rest of her life from a locker she'd filled 15 years ago with the person she wasn't supposed to be anymore. The badge reader had rejected her 3 times. The security guard, the one who'd smiled at her every morning for 3 years, had swiped his own badge instead. He hadn't made eye contact. She was becoming the kind of woman people stopped seeing. Room for 12 stopped her before she reached the stairwell. Men in suits. 3 of them. Standing outside the ranger's room like Secret Service, which meant something had shifted in the last 18 hours. Sarah's hands went still inside the cardboard box. The box contained her scrubs, her personal trauma shears with the faded call sign engraved along the blade, and a photograph of her late husband that she'd hidden in her locker the day she arrived. One of the men saw her. Then all 3 turned. She should have left. Should have walked past. Instead, she found herself moving toward the door, and the men parted without being asked, the way crowds part for people they recognize even when they can't name what they recognize. Wade Morrison was sitting up. Conscious. Alert. The color had come back to his face, though the chest tube was still draining serosanguineous fluid into a collection chamber beside the bed. When he saw her, something flickered across his expression, recognition and relief, and something that looked like he'd been waiting for this. "Senior Chief," he whispered. The room contracted. All the oxygen in Houston seemed to compress into that corner of the ICU. A man in a Saudi diplomatic security uniform stood from a chair that Sarah hadn't seen a moment ago. He was broad-shouldered, mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had commanded men. He spoke in Arabic first, a formal greeting, the kind used between equals, and then switched to English with an accent that placed him from the sunny triangle. Al-Shifa Field Hospital, 2012. You are the American devil woman who removed the shrapnel from my brother's spine when your unit had orders to let insurgent wounded die. Sarah did not move. Did not blink. Hands steady inside the cardboard box. He continued, "My brother lived because you chose conscience over orders. I have spent 12 years trying to find you to say this, thank you." A woman in civilian clothes but unmistakable command present stepped forward. Her suit was tailored. Her shoes were polished. Her eyes had the flat intensity of someone who'd spent 23 years making decisions that killed people. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, Silver Star. The woman paused. Watched for reaction. There was none. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Another beat. Silence in the room had become a physical thing. Navy Cross for actions in Helmand Province where you held a field hospital alone for 11 hours against sustained mortar fire. Sarah's hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From 15 years of pressure-seeking release. The woman slid a folder across the bed. Inside were credentials. CIA. The name on them was not Sarah Chen, but the photograph was her face at age 28, before Helmand, before the nightmares that smelled like diesel and copper. This ranger, the woman continued, is Lieutenant Wade Morrison, undercover federal agent. He's been tracking a medical fraud ring that's been selling classified veteran patient records to hostile intelligence services. Someone in this hospital tried to kill him because he was getting too close to their supplier. Sarah turned slowly toward the door. Dr. Sterling was standing in the hallway, his face the color of surgical gloves. His mouth was moving but producing no sound. Behind him, 2 FBI agents in blue windbreakers were moving through the corridor with the casual precision of people who had already searched everything. One of them walked directly to Sterling and read him his rights in a voice that could have been reading the weather forecast. The language was so familiar to Sarah, she'd heard it in detention facilities from Kandahar to Bagram, that she could have recited it with him. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Sterling's lawyer had arrived in Houston by private plane 36 minutes later. His network, the board chairman he golfed with, the investigator who owed him favors, the OR nurses on his payroll, all evaporated the moment the FBI agents confirmed that he'd been moving fraudulent billing codes for the past 4 years, inflating veteran care reimbursements and pocketing the difference. then panic hiring investigators to bury Sarah because she was the only person in the hospital competent enough to eventually notice the pattern. The security guard, the one who'd smiled at her every morning, found Sarah in the hallway 3 hours later. He was carrying a cardboard box. His hands were steady, but something had shifted in his face. "Dr. Sterling," he said quietly, "I believe you know the way out." The words were not a suggestion. They were a command, the kind that didn't admit refusal. Sterling took the box, his name plaque, his family photo, the Swiss watch his wife had given him, and walked toward the elevator with the kind of slow deliberation of someone calculating how long the fall would be if he jumped from the parking garage instead. The security guard turned to Sarah. For the first time in 3 years, he made direct eye contact. "They told me to find you," he said. "There's something waiting in your locker." It was an envelope. Sealed. The handwriting on the front was her husband's, the letter he'd left with JSOC 15 years ago with instructions, "Only open if my wife resurfaces. Only give to her if she's alive and asking questions." She read it standing in front of her locker, hand steady as surgical steel. "To whoever finds this, the bravest corpsman who ever saved my life is named Sarah. If you're reading this, she's come back. Watch over her. She's the kind of warrior we left in the field, and the only reason I'm going home is because she refused to follow orders that would have let me die. Keep her safe. She won't ask for it." 6 months later, Sarah was teaching combat medicine at Fort Sam Houston. The classroom smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and possibility. She stood in front of 37 medical trainees, nurses, medics, paramedics, and demonstrated advanced field triage on a simulator that bled and breathed and flatlined on command. In a strip mall in South Houston, Dr. Sterling worked Tuesday through Saturday at a walk-in urgent care, mopping floors between patients. The name tag read Steve. When patients asked if he was a doctor, he flinched. When they thanked him for his service, because he'd lie and claim veteran status to build rapport, something in his face cracked. Sarah kept 2 sets of dog tags in her pocket. Her husband's, worn smooth from 15 years of carrying them. And Wade Morrison's, the ranger who'd come into Mercy General bleeding and unidentified and carried the key that unlocked everything. She'd touch them sometimes when she was teaching, when she was showing a class how to pack a compound fracture or start a femoral line, when she was standing in front of the students and remembering what it meant to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Some identities, she'd learned, cannot stay buried when others need saving. Some nurses are more than nurses. Some warriors walk into hospitals in scrubs instead of boots, and their greatest battles happen in places where people come to be healed, not destroyed. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. She's back at Mercy General now, promoted to Director of Combat Medicine. The 75th Ranger Regiment sends their wounded to her ward. The Pentagon calls when they need guidance. And every Monday morning, Sarah Chen walks into work knowing that 15 years of running, 15 years of trying to disappear, had been leading her here all along, not toward anonymity, but toward the only kind of healing that matters, the kind you give to people who've already survived the worst. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, I want to hear about it. Subscribe for more stories where the quiet person in the room turns out to be the most dangerous, and comment below, would you have had the courage to be yourself, or would you have stayed hidden?